What if instead of hearing this ad, you were hearing an entire extra episode of Cinema of Meaning? Well, each month, Tom and I record an extra bonus episode that's available exclusively on our creator-owned streaming service, Nebula. So far, we've talked about Sam Mendes' 1917, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey. And coming up, we have an episode about Nicholas Winding Refn's Drive. To get access to those, just sign up for the Curiosity Stream bundle and you'll get free access to Nebula along with that. The link is in the description below, or you can go to curiositystream.com/cinema of meaning. Get access to the bonus episodes of Cinema of Meaning and our normal episodes ad-free and a week early when you listen on Nebula.
Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to talk about The Batman, directed by Matt Reeves. Thomas, you've seen The Batman once, right?
Yes, I had the chance to see it once.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to catch it in theater 2 times already, but seeing as this is still a brand new release, we'll give you some spoiler-free thoughts first. But just so you know, we are going to do a full breakdown of the film. We're going to talk about all the deeper themes and meanings. For me, I was especially interested in how the Batman revealed both the effectiveness as well as the limitations of the Batman as a larger myth. I think it touched on some important subjects like justice, like radicalization and heroism, and did so in a mostly effective way, but I do have some critical notes. But Thomas, before we get into all that, what fascinated you the most about this latest incarnation of the Batman?
We're going to get into all the thematic stuff, and there's a lot there that's interesting. But if I'm being completely honest, the thing that I liked most about this movie was just the way it looks, the aesthetic, the vibe, the atmosphere. I thought it was one of the most stylistically interesting and inventive, certainly like superhero movies I've seen in a long time. But even aside from that, even just larger blockbuster movies in general, I think the lighting and just the way the sets are designed, just the entire atmosphere of the film, I think is really unique and something that I really enjoyed watching. So that's the biggest thing that popped out to me.
Yeah.
And I'd love to see it again, even just for that element.
I was going to say exactly the same. Yeah, just that it was so just dripping with atmosphere, which it was interesting if you compare it to the previous Batman films. Like Zack Snyder also has a very visual style to it, but still this felt more grounded and realistic, but then again also not in the same way as Nolan's realism felt. Nolan felt realistic, but like Batman in the literal real world, this still felt like a superhero world or like some kind of comic book place. But I think the main difference with Snyder is that Snyder is really focused on getting these. I think he just maximizes every image for ultimate visual quality. So you get these cool hero shots, but they mostly feel like more like moments than like a real sense of place.
Yeah.
And I think that's where Matt Reeves really distinguishes this Batman film in terms of the atmosphere, that he creates Gotham as this real yet also a bit of a fantastical place. Like it had the gothic elements, but yet it also feels lived in and grounded. And I thought it looked just the atmosphere of it just is what stayed with me. Like.
Yeah.
For a couple of days afterwards, because at first I was hesitant about like, am I going to enjoy this a second time? Because it did feel quite dreary. Like it was raining all the time, mostly night. The film's 3 hours long, but to my not really to my surprise, but I enjoyed it the second time just as much as the first time, and it didn't bother me at all.
Yeah,
which just goes to show like how immersive of an atmosphere it was, and just how great it is just being in it and just experiencing it.
it reminded me a lot of, I'm such a sucker for like rain in movies.
Mm-hmm.
And there's portions of this that reminded me a lot of like Seven and kind of the atmosphere that is built up in certain
Mm-hmm.
parts of Seven. But it's just like so committed to that dark, grimy world for such a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
I love when directors take a big stylistic swing. And so I was excited to see that Matt Reeves was doing that here.
Mm-hmm.
I've come to really enjoy Robert Pattinson as a performer. He's taken on some really weird roles, and so his commitment to doing like unusual stuff kind of made me excited for this movie, because I was like, well, maybe
Mm-hmm.
if Pattinson is doing this Batman, that probably means he's finding something interesting and different to explore here. And I think that ends up being the case. And even though
Mm-hmm.
when he was cast, everybody was kind of like, huh, like that's an interesting choice. I think he ends up actually being like a pretty fascinating Batman.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Well, what was your first impression of this Batman, like the character, not the film?
One of the first things that hit me is, and I'll preface this by saying like, I'm not a huge Batman connoisseur. I haven't
Mm-hmm.
seen I haven't seen some of like the Clooney Batmans or like some of the earlier Batmans. Like Batman in my mind is the Nolan Batmans.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the ones that I kind of like cut my teeth on as a teenager.
Same for me.
But the thing that really struck me with this one is just like his like menace and bulk. Like the suit is way bulkier and kind of just grungy and gnarly. I think they did a really great job with his costume design of just like giving us a Batman that is a little bit more, he's not the confident put together Batman that we get in the Nolan series with like, you know, huge endless amounts of high tech gear at his fingertips to craft like thousands of versions of the right mask until he gets it just right. It's like, no, this mask is like got little chips in it and like it's kind of leather that's like stitched together. And yeah, I kind of loved all that stuff in contrast.
I also love the way you could hear his footsteps before, like you could feel the weight of his arrival out of the shadows before you could actually see him.
Yeah.
It felt a bit like Jurassic Park or something, where they really built the anticipation of the arrival of the Batman, or in this case, the introduction. But yeah, throughout the film, he moves around with this heaviness that almost literally like shakes the earth a little bit.
Yeah, there's more I would say about the character, but I don't want to get into spoiler territory quite yet. So what I will say that I think isn't a spoiler is that this is a sufficiently new take on kind of the presentation of the Batman, at least versus the two recent versions that we've gotten.
Yeah.
I think there's something interesting here, and it doesn't feel like an overly redundant portrayal of the character.
Yeah. I thought it was really interesting that we got so much of the literal Batman in this film. Like there's hardly any Bruce Wayne in it.
Yes.
That to me was like a big change compared to some of the previous films. And I think it worked mostly. There's some issues I have with the Bruce Wayne, or at least the amount of presence that we have of him that we will get into later. But overall, I like that we actually got to see a lot of the Batman. It's like they got like an awesome suit together and they wanted to show it off as much as possible. But
yeah.
What did you think about the length? Did it, like the 3 hours, it's quite long. How did you experience it at? Did you feel the length, or?
It felt like I'll say it felt like a 2.5 hour movie to me. So it felt kind of long. It didn't feel like the full 3 hours. There was a few, like, I felt like it maybe could have been a bit shorter, and I'll get into that in the spoiler section. So it didn't feel like, there's some people I saw saying, I don't know, maybe you were one of them, that like it flew by and it didn't feel long at all. It did feel long to me, but I don't think it's like super bloated or super overly. It wasn't enough for me to like make me uncomfortable and like get bored. But I think it probably could have been a little bit shorter. But yeah, how did you feel about the length?
I didn't mind the length. I kind of liked it. It reminded me a bit of Zodiac, also a David Fincher film.
Yeah.
Which is a film that we may or may not have already recorded an episode on. Time will tell. But yeah, I like that it as with Zodiac, they are both these detective stories, and so they spent a lot of time with the clues and with the mystery that's presented by the villain of the respective stories. I think the Riddler obviously copied some elements of the Zodiac in that film or that real life story.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was mostly along for the ride. I enjoyed like the slower pace, and I thought the pacing was overall pretty great. Like I didn't feel there were
I
any,
agree.
especially on the second viewing, I didn't feel there were any like particularly slow parts that could have been easily cut out. Because it's an easy thing to say for
Yes.
like, oh, it should have been shorter, but then you have
Right.
to like take another look and cut out actual scenes. And
Yeah.
I think in this case, there are some moments that, not necessarily scenes that I felt were unnecessary, but there's some moments where it does like linger on a particular shot. Like there's one, it's not really a spoiler, but there's one moment where the Batman opens a cage and he takes out like this envelope that's left there by the Riddler. And that shot, it takes like 15 seconds or something. He reaches in
Yeah.
so ridiculously slow, especially on the second viewing. And even though it doesn't build really much to any like suspense, it's not the first time he's done it. Like it's
Right.
the Riddler at this point. The Riddler has already left clues to the Batman, so he kind of knows what to expect, and yet they still expand that moment way beyond
Yeah.
what is necessary. But yeah, that's just like nitpicking a little bit. It's not really. I don't think it hurt the overall pacing of the movie.
Yeah. I enjoyed the pace overall.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just like a 3-hour movie is just hard not to feel like for me anyway, like it really, like it's the exception, I think, with a 3-hour movie that there's not some element that it feels like, well, this maybe could have been a little bit shorter. And movies are trending longer in certain directions anyway. So I might just have fatigue from like longer blockbusters, but I definitely felt less like I had less problems with the length here than even with like the Eternals, which I think was only was like 2.5 or something like that.
Yeah.
So So overall, the length didn't bother me that much.
I think for me oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask if there's any other non-spoilery things that we can really mention here.
I was just going to add that it comes back to the atmosphere as well. Like I didn't mind the length because I just enjoyed being in that vibe for however long it took. Like I'm not sure it was exactly 3 hours, but then even though you feel the length, it doesn't really matter because you want to stay in it.
Yeah,
I would even be open to an extended cut just to see what was left on the table and just to be in that world like a little bit longer.
Yeah.
But in short, like what was your overall spoiler-free judgment of the film? Like, did you like it? Would you recommend it?
I would recommend it in general.
Mm-hmm.
I'm down on superhero movies overall. Like there's a decent amount of them I skip or I'm not super interested in. This was one of my favorite that I've seen in a long time. It held my interest way more than any others recently, and I thought it was stylistically really compelling. There was still like a few elements of it that I didn't like that we'll get into, but overall, like I felt like it was an interesting movie. It was worth my time. I enjoyed a lot of aspects of it. So, even with its flaws, like definitely one of the best films in this kind of genre overall that I've seen in probably a couple of years.
Might be too soon, but do you know like where you would, right now, where would you rank it like among the other Batman films that you've seen?
I don't know if it's better than The Dark Knight, but it's better than at least The Dark Knight Rises. I would say pretty confidently. I don't know. I think I have to see it again.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would be like somewhere in the middle of the Nolan Batmans currently for me, probably.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I thought it was a beautiful film. It has some of my favorite superhero shots that of any film that I've seen. I thought it was a good story. It had some interesting thematic explorations, even though I think it's kind of limited by what it has to be as well as a Batman story. But yeah, overall, I enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I would. I loved all the performances. The music I thought was really well done. So yeah, for me, it's also too soon I wouldn't rank it above The Dark Knight. That for me, in one sentence, I think The Dark Knight still has more thematic clarity than this film had.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
But I'd be interested to see, especially if there are sequels to this film, where this, or just as time passes and people have had a chance to really digest it, like I'm interested to see where this would end up in the general consensus of good Batman stories, because I do think it's definitely going to be ranked among the best.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I definitely need that time
Mm-hmm.
to kind of sort out, like, I'm such a sucker for the style and the
Mm-hmm.
mood. So I need that time to kind of like sort out like how much of it is just like this was a really cool movie to watch, and then how much of it is like there's stuff here to think about and that actually kind of stays with you and is an
Mm-hmm.
interesting take on the character. So we'll get into some of that in what we're about to do, which is do spoiler territory.
Yeah.
So
Okay, so moving into spoiler territory, let's just break it down from the beginning, I think.
yeah.
We open with what I guess people thought was going to be a origin story for the Batman. Like, it opens with this young boy. Actually, it opens with someone watching this young boy from across the street, and who's
Right.
obviously like living in a wealthy place, and his parents come home, and there's this sense of dread as the camera, this unknown spectator, which of course is later revealed to be the Riddler, is up to some suspicious things, to say the least. And but then you quickly we cut to inside the house, and there's this news report, and it says that there's already a vigilante that's been active for the last 2 years. So we're actually not seeing the Waynes or the Wayne family. We're seeing a different family, and so this is not the origin story for the Batman. It's the introduction to the Riddler.
Yeah.
So yeah, what was your initial impression when you saw this character? Like, what were your first thoughts on the villain of this story?
The villain I found adequate, I would say. I don't think it's not the most compelling part of
Mm-hmm.
the story. I think it's like, the Batman films are interesting in that, like, the Joker as a presence
Yeah.
within the sort of mythos is almost like as big as Batman. Like it's kind of become a cultural force that is maybe even arguably like bigger and more recognized. Well, I don't know. It's a hard one to say, but like
Mm-hmm.
the Joker and the Batman are on. So there's this weird like tension in this film, even though the Riddler isn't the Joker. It's kind of like everything is in relation to like what the Joker is and represents.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed this presentation. I think it was fine. It made for a good foil and served the plot, and I think Paul Dano
Mm-hmm.
was fine in the role. But I wasn't like wow, this is terrifying or super gripping
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
anything like that. How about you?
I think it was also he feels a bit more on the background. He's not as prominent
Yes.
as a Heath Ledger's Joker was, but I
Right.
think it's also because the focus is more on, at least at first, on the puzzles of the Riddler and not so
Yes.
much the character of the Riddler.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do feel like ever since the Joker in The Dark Knight, that there's been this like expectation that every new villain has to be either like that or at least on somewhat
Yeah.
in that direction. Like, I feel the Riddler 2 was doing that overly eccentric, like the handheld recording scenes of like victims and then just talking really slow and then
Yeah.
yelling suddenly, and it had the classic Batman villain touches that
Yeah.
were mostly, I think, introduced with the Joker, and or at least popularized by him. But yeah, I think the Riddler is most interesting as a reaction to the Batman in this film, which I thought
Right.
was really interesting. So I think we actually should talk about the Batman first and what his character and
Yeah.
what he represents in this film, because when we meet him, like that's the scene after, I think that's one of the best montages of what the Batman is in any Batman film we've seen so far. We get the voiceover, which reminded me a little bit of Watchmen and Rorschach's Journal, but he describes he's been active for 2 years, and he doesn't feel like he's had much of an effect because, as is noted, like ever since the Waynes died or his family died, like crime has only gone up and like murders have gone up. And so we have the Batman, he's been active for 2 years, but he's struggling with the question of, is he making a difference? And so in the opening scene, we get introduced to his method, basically. Like we get to see his idea of what is wrong with the city and how he is planning to, or what he's doing about it. And so we get this montage, we see crime and we see multiple different crimes happening, and the Batman explains like he can't be everywhere, but he wants criminals to think that he is everywhere. Like he says, I'm not hiding in the shadows, like I am the shadows.
Yeah.
And that for me pretty much captured this iteration of the Batman. Like I think he's more out to punish people or punish bad people than he is concerned with helping good people. I think that's his sort of starting point. Because I really liked how you see he does come out of the shadows when a group of these thugs attack this innocent man, and then he beats them up. But then as he's trying to help the victim is actually also scared of the Batman, which I thought was a really telling moment as to how the general population looks to this character. Like he's feared not just by criminals, but he's basically feared by everyone.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts on all this?
I agree with everything you said. I like, to the point, the very first thing you said, I like that we don't get an origin story again, that it just kind of drops us into, a world where the Batman kind of exists and we get his philosophy. And there's that very key line. It might come later. I forget where it is, but like you kind of expect somebody ask him who he is, or there's some kind of, and he almost drops that, like, I'm the Batman calling card, but instead of the Batman, it's I'm vengeance, which is even in the trailer, I believe, or something.
Yeah. That's the same scene where he's attacking the men who are attacking the innocent.
Yeah. So it's in that first kind of introduction. And I think that like distills what you're talking about down to the very core, which is like, he is about like revenge, punishment, and fear. Like that's the way he's the level on which he's operating in this version. And I think that comes to play a really critical role in like possibly his arc and like what's happening at the end of the movie. So we'll definitely talk more about that. But I really liked that version. I also like that I already kind of mentioned this, like aesthetically, he's a less confident Batman. Like his technology is a little more flimsy, or like all these other things. But the Batman himself, like you were mentioning, is already kind of like, I don't know if I'm making a difference. Like this is a Batman that is kind of riddled, sorry, no pun intended, with self-doubt, like, and he's not sure if what he's doing is valuable. Like he has to question himself. There's I don't want to get ahead of us, but there's a moment where he's running away from the police and he gets up onto the top of the building and he goes to like base jump off of it, and where like with Nolan's Batman, we would expect like he just does it and like a perfect execution and it's confident. He's nervous to jump off of this building and then it doesn't really go super well. And I feel like that was this Batman in like a nutshell. Was like, you know, he's trying and he has things he wants to accomplish, but like he's maybe even not that good of a Batman. Like he, you know, he's good at beating people up, but like,
but even then, like in the first fight scene, they get some punches into it. Like it's not just him taking them down flawlessly. He definitely still getting hurt.
So I really enjoyed that aspect of like, you know, they're already from the beginning, we have this element of like, he's unsure about himself. He's unsure about whether his methods are working, and that kind of really sets the tone for, I think, what the movie's doing.
Yeah, he's still trying to figure it out and still trying to figure out the best way to help the city. And I think also in some way he's still not sure how to diagnose the problem that he's trying to solve. Like you also get a sense he's he does have a quite privileged look on
Yes.
crime and poverty, and like especially later on when he meets Catwoman, and she talks about her friends who gets involved with some of the mafia people, and he immediately blames there's like a little bit of victim blaming also, like, oh,
Yeah.
if she didn't want those consequences, then she should have been a better person, or not, she should
Yeah.
have not entered into crime territory or something like that. But yeah, I think that also goes into the Bruce Wayne character of this film, who's also quite different. I think that's where he perhaps distinguishes himself the most from the other Batmans, because the crime fighter has always been there in all of the
Right.
iterations, and I think when we moved from the Christian Bale Batman in the Nolan films to the, I was going to say Batfleck, the Ben Affleck
Right.
Batman, that there already we saw this transition from a Batman who was like rational and stoic to a Batman who was more unhinged and already more punishing, rather than really one who's striving for justice, and also one who was more driven by trauma than by like philosophical reasoning, as is
Yeah.
you see more in the Nolan's films. But when you look at the Bruce Wayne with the Ben Affleck, he was still the billionaire playboy that the Bruce Wayne in Nolan's films also was. But here we finally get to see, I think, the most realistic Bruce
Right.
Wayne,
Yeah. Yeah.
like the one who's, I think this is what it truly looks like to be 100% dedicated to being the Batman at night, and
Yeah.
showing what kind of consequences that would have for the daily life, or his citizens
Yeah.
persona, because you see him just mostly sulking around his big gothic mansion, or
Right.
like the tower, and
I feel like the difference is just like established through how he looks too. It's like he just
yeah,
like he takes off the mask and his eyes are just like, he's like
yeah.
he's emo Batman. It's like very, you know, Rob Patton. I love I
He's so
feel
pale from the
yeah, he's pale. I
lack of
think
sunlight.
and Pattinson really drives home, I think, a difference between the two personas in an interesting way. Like with Bale's Batman, it's like you can see a confidence coming through in both of them,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like, oh, he's changing his voice so that you don't know who he is or whatever. He acts a little more cocky as Bruce Wayne or whatever. But this one, it felt like when the mask came off, it was like this is a completely different character.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed that. Like they
Mm-hmm.
they established the difference with Bruce Wayne very efficiently,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah,
He mostly looks like he has the worst hangover ever.
yes, yeah, which like you would expect if you're maybe like
Yeah.
running around, staying up all night, jumping off
Yeah.
of buildings, and like walking around in this huge bulky suit. I think to some extent this portrayal matches a lot more with kind of the shifting perception and opinion of like billionaires in popular culture. Like I think when
Mm-hmm.
Nolan's Batmans were coming out, it was still maybe a little bit more trendy, but like to have like, oh, there's this cool billionaire guy with all this tech, and public opinion in a certain way has shifted, and we have all these figures now who are like kind of looked down upon or don't, like Mark Zuckerberg, Jeffrey Bezos, all these people who
Mm-hmm.
are the billionaires in our world don't come across as these like cool, like we can't imagine them moonlighting as vigilantes
Mm-hmm.
because they don't, like that's not how
Yeah.
they appear to us.
That's how they get away with it.
That's yeah, exactly. It's the perfect disguise.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I felt like this Bruce Wayne was like very
Yeah.
much felt like a 2020 Bruce
Yeah.
Wayne. Like he fits into the the culture that
Mm-hmm.
we're more familiar with at this time.
Yeah. I also like these subtle changes in posture. Like when he's in the Batman suit, he stands tall and heavy and more confident. Like not completely, but
Yeah.
he's more stoic. Also, when you see him interact with the police, like he has a presence, and he emits this fear, and he has a certain like command that he doesn't have at all as Bruce Wayne, when he stands a little bit more coward, like
Yeah.
he's more quiet and more self-conscious almost. Like it's almost like he feels naked without the Batman suit, like that
Yes.
he's almost embarrassed and doesn't want to be, he feels exposed or something. which I thought was really interesting, and also is a good sign, I think, of his, like, that he still has some unresolved trauma.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned how we don't get the origin story, but I feel like they captured all of that perfectly when Batman sees the little boy whose father just got murdered by the Riddler. Like, he
Yeah.
just walks, the scene takes place at this crime scene, and then he walks out, but he glances into another room, and there you see the little boy who just had his father murdered. Like, he's crying and obviously traumatized, and you see, in just with looking at the Batman's face, you can see all of his own trauma also still being like, it's still way up there. Like, he
Yeah.
hasn't processed that in a healthy way, I think, and Pattinson did a great job at communicating that, I think.
Yeah. That was an excellent shorthand for kind of like
Mm-hmm.
reminding and inserting the origin story and
Yeah.
those elements without like having to go back and rehash,
Mm-hmm.
something that realistically almost everybody who's seeing this movie probably has either already
Yeah.
seen or is just kind of familiar with the story of through
Yeah.
osmosis. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's, I think, one of the film definitely was able to take these shortcuts because we all have already become so familiar with the Batman story.
Yeah.
Like, I think when Nolan first did Batman Begins, I think they were coming off like the lesser renowned Batman film, so it felt like he had to re-win a new audience, or like reintroduce this character to a new audience, or at least a new generation. So he had to do more like heavy lifting, but now we've seen the Nolan films, we've seen the Zack Snyder films. Now we know who the Batman is and where he comes from, and so we don't have to rethread that, all those same story beats again over and over,
Yes.
and we can jump right into it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure why. I think it was a comment someone made somewhere, but someone said it. It felt like a sequel to an origin story that we already got earlier, which
Yes.
I think was pretty interesting because that was kind of how it felt. I also liked, for example, how the relation between Batman and Gordon was already established. Like, it
Yeah.
was already assumed that they were total pals and completely trusted each other and more than anyone else. And we just jumped straight into them being friends without having to build that relationship over the course of the film, as we've already seen
Yeah.
in the previous films. So,
And that was something I truly loved about this movie was that there's a decent portion of it that's just kind of like Batman and his little band of like he's got Gordon, he's got Catwoman, he's got Alfred, and like they're just
mhm,
solving a mystery. And that's like almost an hour of the movie. And I think it portrays something like this Batman actually really needs the help of all those people. Like if you look at each step and what he
mhm,
discovers, it's like Gordon and Catwoman and Alfred, like Alfred helps him solve certain puzzles and like he's really only accomplishing what he's accomplishing because he
mhm,
has help from this little group of people. And I love that portrayal. Like it didn't feel like, oh, he's just this super talented guy who has all this technology and is such a
mhm.
badass fighter that he's able to accomplish all of this on his own.
Yeah.
He's definitely still a central figure and necessary in like, accomplishing things, but like
Mhm.
he couldn't have done it without the help of the people who are around him.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really fun and
Yeah.
cool.
I think that also plays an important part in his character arc. Like,
Yes.
if because in the beginning he is presented as someone who has a slightly privileged worldview, I think,
Hmm.
and you can see that those flaws in his own perception are being exposed by some of the other characters.
Yes.
I wrote a couple of them down, actually. There's, like, for example, um, so just to
Yeah.
summarize the main plots real quick, we have the Riddler, who is trying to expose this massive corruption in Gotham, and he's setting out basically punishing those who have been part of that corruption and leaving clues to the Batman. Like, he leaves notes. Every crime scene, you see a note to the Batman, which has some kind of clue that will lead to the next victim. And the goal ultimately is to find the Rat, or some character who played a intrinsic part in setting up a deal 2 years earlier that got like one of the major crime bosses and one of the major drug operations exposed and got that crime boss arrested. But then as the Riddler is trying to expose that was actually this big conspiracy theory that didn't save the city, but is actually just pushing the darkness into the shadows. Like it's just covering things up instead of actually doing any good.
Yeah.
And so, we have Batman. He sets out to solve these riddles, but along the way, it's interesting how many of the clues are actually, or just in general, how Batman's own privileged upbringing, like he's still, he has a traumatized past, but he's still like, he grows up with wealth and security and support, which causes him to be lacking in some like more real world knowledge. Like, for example, you have this scene where they capture the Penguin, and they're trying to, they're talking about them with a clue, and then the Penguin sort of laughs at him and Gordon because the Batman doesn't know any Spanish, and so they fail to see what the significance was of that clue, because it talked about El Rada, and it should have been La Rada.
La Rada,
I think. Yeah, my Spanish is also is non-existent, basically. But so you see that it's clear that like he doesn't speak any Spanish, like he has no knowledge of any other languages except for his own. And then of course Selina, the Catwoman, she's also plays this. She sort of mirrors Batman in also being a vigilante, but being one without his means and without his technological advantage. But she does have a better understanding of what actually makes criminals be criminals. She knows where to be compassionate, where the Batman does not. And so because she's really looking out for her friends, she's trying to like save people from that world instead of just punishing them for being in it. So I think she really calls Batman out on certain moments where he's just basically being unsympathetic and therefore also actually being misguided in the actions that follow that. In the same way, you have the Riddler, who at some point towards the end, I think when they're doing the confession, talks about what it really means to be an orphan. Like Batman was an orphan, but he still had, as I talked about earlier, he was sheltered in his upbringing, whereas the Riddler was forced to fend on his own, and he didn't have the love and support that Batman may have gotten. But my favorite one is actually when towards the end, the Batman is looking at the carpet tool that the Riddler used as a murder weapon, and then it's just like the cop who's on duty there to just security. He's the one who just happens to know the guy. Like he says something like, "Oh, my uncle is a carpenter, so he knows what that tool is." And so I feel that that's also something that's like obvious to like the working class. Like, oh yeah, that's a tool for carpets, but obviously Bruce Wayne wouldn't know that because like when has he ever done carpeting in his life or paid attention to something like that? So it's interesting how throughout the film you see Bruce Wayne or the Batman failing to connect certain dots because of his lack of real world knowledge. Like he is someone who's been raised in a bit of an ivory tower where he's quite literally looking down on the city and its problems, and which is also, I think, led to him adopting a strategy to solve crime, or like what he thinks will solve the city's problems in a rather misguided way ultimately.
Yeah. The element I think I found most fascinating about this Batman was that those kinds of ideas have always kind of been in the background of Batman, intrinsically in like the character, like the idea of this wealthy vigilante who, whose father was this huge figure in this city, but then the city is corrupt. Like it's fascinating to think about that the interplay between that of like, oh, there's all this crime in, the Nolan Batmans or past Batmans, there's all this crime in Gotham, and if you think about like our real world understandings of crime and like wealth disparity and how that plays a role in those kinds of things, it's like, it's fascinating that the approach that Batman ends up taking is like, I'm going to take out the bad guys with my resources instead of helping the poor or something like that. And so I feel like this version really brings that tension that kind of has existed there, at least in most of the versions of Batman that I've seen, and brings that like a little bit more to the forefront where, it's part of the conflict of the story, and Batman himself is kind of having to grapple with that in a very real way.
Yeah. I definitely think that the Batman, just generally the Batman as a character and Gotham as a world, is to some extent a bit of a reactionary story.
Yeah,
It does is to some extent also a like a power fantasy. Like just it plays into that emotional satisfaction of when you look at that opening scene, for example, of seeing injustice being done by like some assholes, and you just want to step, like the fancy of just
yeah,
stepping up and just beating the living shit out of them. I think that's it does play into like something that's very emotionally satisfying, and I
right.
won't deny
Yes.
like I'm also always down for it. Like when I see a scene like that, I do get like riled up, and I'm like yeah, get him. There's definitely some part of me that resonates with a lot with that kind of energy, but I also know like more intellectually, like that's not the way forward, probably. Like that's not the
Right.
best
Yeah.
way to actually solve crime on like a structural level. And I think we all
Yeah.
know that to some extent, but that's like the trouble of making that connection between letting go of what is immediately satisfying to do that which isn't as satisfying, or at least when you in storytelling terms, like if Bruce Wayne had just like set up different charities and
Right.
educated people, that's it's just not as cinematic as putting on a
Yeah.
suit like that and stalking the night in
Yeah.
search of criminals to punch in the face.
Yeah. Yeah. That's not a movie,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
but to what extent do you think that you because the film does, as you said, it brings it forward and it wants to critique it to some extent, but it also
Yeah.
has to be the exciting Batman film. So
Yeah.
I feel to some extent you kind of run into the Fight Club problem, where the film
Right.
presents an ideology or like some philosophy or some idea that is very, or that it itself wants to criticize, and actually like it literally does so at the end, but then it has brought it up in such an appealing way that the emotion of the original thing, that lingers like stronger than the correction that happens at the end.
Yes.
To what
Yeah.
extent do you think that's an issue with this Batman, or just the Batman in general?
That's a difficult question because I
Mm-hmm.
mean, like you alluded to, it applies to a much broader swath of cinema than
Mm-hmm.
even just Batman. You know, can you critique an idea while engaging with the thing that makes it kind of
Mm-hmm.
enticing to begin with? I think I would tentatively say like you can. Like I think there's obviously people who misinterpret or misunderstand Fight Club or like take the wrong message away from some of these movies. But I think for me personally, like part of my understanding of some of these critiques
Mm-hmm.
of like the use of violent revenge or something like that have come from expressions of art that sort of like lure you in, like things like Taxi Driver can kind of lure in
Mm-hmm.
people with a certain kind of mentality and show why that might be enticing to some people, but then subvert that and
Mm-hmm.
kind of show you the end game of that and why like it going down that path is not a great way to go. And this goes back, I mean, it's in literature. Like Dostoevsky is like
Mm-hmm.
that's the core of some of his
Yeah.
novels is
And
like,
Crime and
you
Punishment,
know,
most notably.
yeah,
Yeah.
illustrating kind of this mentality and drawing you into that and then kind of showing the payoff of that. So it's not without its flaws, and there are always going to be people
Mm-hmm.
who kind of take something I think the wrong way. But I think it's an interesting maneuver, certainly at the very least, to try to like entice
Mm-hmm.
people and then critique that element that is enticed.
Yeah.
And if people are going to engage with, wow, it's, oh, it's cool to like beat up bad guys, I'd rather they engage with that emotion in a movie that actually like deals with that in a nuanced way than just goes fully
Mm-hmm.
into that and like
Yeah.
accepts it as a valid way to kind of
Yeah.
engage with the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because yeah, as we said, the Batman does want to critique to some extent
Yes.
the message of, or the idea of using violence and vengeance to solve criminality, or just achieve some kind of justice. How did you feel the film went about doing that? How did you experience like Batman's character arc over the course of this film?
I already mentioned I love the setup of coming in with a Batman that's a little bit kind of self-critical or unsure of himself, doubting kind of his impact or what the right way to go about things is. And then he has voices from the outside who are kind of, there's the politician, the lady who's running for mayor, and she says to Bruce Wayne specifically, like, you could be doing so much good with your wealth. Like, she kind of challenges him, and Catwoman is challenging some of his assumptions about things. And within the story itself, he's being challenged, like you mentioned, to even solve the riddles he's having to overlook. So I think that arc is there in a very interesting way. And I love that it comes, this is something we haven't talked about yet, but it actually comes to a point most explicitly where it's kind of revealed that the Riddler, one of the people he's going after is Bruce Wayne, because because Thomas Wayne, Bruce Wayne's father, was corrupt, and he gave this money to a renewal fund, and that renewal fund money was used in all these different ways. And so like Batman is having to like very literally grapple with this idea of like, am I part of the problem? Was my father part of the problem? Like, what is my role and complicity in all of this, and Gotham and the corruption and the problems? And I love how that was presented. They kind of backtrack a little bit, and I think softball it, because he goes and talks to Alfred then, and Alfred's kind of like, no, you've seen it twice, so maybe you can correct me, but the way I remember it being presented was like, Alfred kind of presents it as like Thomas Wayne had good intentions and he was a good man. It just like things just kind of went wrong, and he wasn't actually as corrupt as like the Riddler is claiming, which I felt like kind of took the wind out of some of the sails of like actually really having to examine his complicity in like a hardcore way. Like they didn't linger in that ambiguity. Although there is a little bit of that left. I mean, what was your opinion of that kind of maneuver?
I think I understand what you're trying to point out, but I think it was actually quite an important moment, because before that, as you said, Bruce Wayne learns that his father wasn't as perfect as he thought, because the thing was, I think he set up the renewal fund, but that wasn't the source of his corruption. The source of his corruption was that he turned to Falcone, the mob boss, to initially to just scare like a journalist who had some damning information about Bruce's mother, or like his father's wife, Martha. I'm not sure if that's canon also in this film, but probably. I think it was that in this story, at least, Bruce's mother had been in and out of mental hospitals. Like, she wasn't well mentally, and his father had been trying to cover that up, seemingly because he wants to run for office, and so he didn't want to have that on the family record, so to say.
Yes.
And so a journalist finds out and tries to expose it, and then Bruce's father turns to Falcone, who then ends up killing that journalist. And so initially it seems that like Batman's or Bruce's father is like corrupt, like that's because that fits his initial worldview, because people are either good or they are corrupted, and then they are no longer good. So, and I think what Alfred added to that understanding is that it showed in a really personal way for Bruce Wayne that good people can make mistakes, and that doesn't make them inherently corrupt or irredeemable. They can just, sometimes people in a moment of despair, they can go a wrong direction, or they can make a mistake, and that doesn't mean even if their intentions are good, because as Alfred says, like, Bruce's father didn't actually care about his campaign. He just wanted to protect his mother and her well-being, because when that would be exposed, like the stress for his mother would just be too much. And so he wanted to protect her actually from all that. So it was an act of love, you could say. Like, it wasn't, even if it ended up leading to this corruption. So yeah, I think that's what that scene signified, or at least was supposed to signify.
Well, that's a good point, and
Mm-hmm.
I like the idea of including the fact that even with good intentions, you can kind of end up complicit in something that
Mm-hmm.
in corruption, like because that is a reality in the world that there's a lot of people who don't have explicitly evil intentions, but still end up being a part of something
Mm-hmm.
that isn't good.
Yeah.
So maybe you've changed my mind on that scene. I don't know. We'll see. I'll have to watch it again. To the rest of that arc, though, I think we should talk about like um, towards the end. There's a really great moment that I think fully like signifies the end of his arc, and we can talk about the third act kind of in a more broad sense. But
Mm-hmm.
within that, there's this moment where Batman's confronted the Riddler. Then, there's kind of this climactic scene in this stadium, and there's all these goons
Mm-hmm.
firing rifles, trying to assassinate the mayor, I think is their primary goal, but they're
Yeah.
also maybe just shooting at people in
Yeah, I think
general.
just it was just like a killing spree or like an intended.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which we can talk about that. That,
Mm-hmm.
that wasn't, I didn't love that part of the movie. But anyway, Batman's trying to deal with these people, and he like beats up one of them, and the goon like steals his line and says,
Yeah.
"I'm vengeance." And then Batman has this like moment of realization, and then he jumps onto this power line, and you think almost like he's going to kill himself, and he like cuts the line to save the people and falls into the water, and there's this kind of like death and like very sort of explicit like death rebirth imagery
Mm-hmm.
that happens. And so there's this sense of like he's putting to death a certain part of himself, that I am vengeance. He
Yeah.
sees that reflected in, which another key aspect of this arc is that when he confronts the Riddler finally, we think for a moment that the Riddler knows that Bruce Wayne is Batman.
Mm-hmm.
But then we find
Yeah.
out when he meets him that the Riddler didn't know that. He was out to kill Bruce Wayne because he hates Bruce Wayne. But Batman, he thinks they were on the same side. They were on a
Mm-hmm.
team. They were working towards the same goals of destroying
Yeah.
corruption. And so Batman kind of sees like, oh, this element of myself, this retributive,
Mm-hmm.
vengeance element of myself, he sees that reflected in the villains.
Mm-hmm.
And then he kind of puts that part of himself to death, falls into the water, and then immediately after that he like ignites a flare, and he becomes a beacon of light, and he does something for the first time in the film that he didn't do before, which is he goes
Mm-hmm.
over to people and he like helps people out of the
Mm-hmm.
wreckage. So there's this very like strong, powerful image of like Batman going from like
Mm-hmm.
being the source of vengeance to
Yeah.
like instead being someone who is helping. And I
Yeah.
really loved that move. I loved all that imagery.
Yeah. It's so literal almost, because he literally says like, I am the shadow in the beginning, and in the end he becomes
Right.
the literal light.
He
That
becomes the
guy.
light at the
Yeah.
end. Yes.
One of my favorite shots that I mentioned earlier or at the beginning was that when he's in the wreckage and he stands there with the flare. I thought
Yeah.
that was just like one of the most beautiful
Yeah.
superhero shots like I've ever seen. My main issue with like, I like where it all ends like thematically, but and besides for like, you can nitpick a little bit how there's like a convenient power cable hanging there to prove his
Right.
his newfound sense of altruism. And
Yeah.
obviously, like, I think the best way to show someone helping people, or the most dramatic way, is when you have this environmental hazard, like when you don't have to punch someone, but just
Right.
have to lift like something heavy or something, like pull
Yeah.
some people out of the wreckage. I think those are the most compelling shots from a drama point of view when it comes to
Yeah.
showing people helping each other. But I did feel like, or like I was wondering to what extent it really is earned. Like, he shows that he now is ready to like focus on helping people instead of just
Yes.
punishing people. But I didn't feel like that was quite established as well as it could be before. Like, we don't see Batman like refusing to help people earlier in favor of
Right.
like imagine if there was like some scene where he could either chase after the criminal or help people who were like in some sort of problematic
Yeah.
situation, and then we would have seen him go after the criminal instead. That was a bit of my issue. Like, we don't see the citizens of Gotham as much, and you don't really get a sense in how they play into the conflict at all, like the whole
Yeah.
story, except for maybe we get that moment, as I said at the beginning, where Batman saves this innocent person, and the innocent person is scared of Batman. But other than that,
Yeah.
you don't really get a sense of where the citizens are at during this whole character arc.
Yeah.
But I guess that's the thing with, because it uses other characters or like secondary characters instead of like crowds as a whole to,
Yeah.
because I think Catwoman is mostly the connection to the people or like the misunderstood people of society. You have the Riddler, who is maybe shows the darker side of Batman. We'll get to him in a minute, I
Yeah.
think. You see Alfred, who's also connected to the line between good and evil and how it's not as strict as it would appear. And yeah, you get like stand-in characters for like, I think, the citizens of Gotham, that I think it works, but it doesn't feel as visceral as, or that it would have felt like if you had like more inclusions, I think, of like actual crowds of citizens and
Yeah. Yeah.
seeing how this is all affecting them and how they are feeling
Yeah.
throughout all of this.
Yeah. I definitely agree. That was one thing in hindsight. Like I didn't think about it. It didn't bother me while I was watching the film, but in hindsight, I was like, the only characters in this movie are, a politician or a police officer or Batman or a vigilante. Like you don't see any people really, for the most part. You have that one woman who's a friend of Celine of Catwoman, but then she's just kind of like ends up being a dead body, and a plot point.
Yeah.
And then you kind of have the masked people at the end as kind of an extension of Riddler. So all those people are represented symbolically, as you mentioned, through other characters, but we never actually connect.
Yeah, there's one moment or one scene where the memorial is held for the mayor, where you see people outside and they are protesting, and they seem to be sort of on the Riddler's side, but not like it's not as explicit, and we don't see the change in their point of view like later on. Like we don't see them like, oh, we were wrong about this, but or something like that. But yeah, I think let's get to the Riddler, because that, as you said, like there's a moment towards the end where this revealed that the Riddler thought that Batman has been his ally, that they were doing this together as like buddies, and that he doesn't even know who Bruce Wayne is, or at least doesn't know that Bruce Wayne is the Batman, which I guess was also already foreshadowed by the moment where Bruce Wayne receives the bomb package, or that was intended for Bruce, but then there's the fireproof message attached to the Batman, so he clearly didn't know like they were one and the same.
Yes.
Which I thought was an interesting clue in hindsight, but
I didn't even think of that. But you definitely, like, watching the movie, I definitely thought like, oh, they build it up in such a way that you think, you're like, oh, he knows, because it's portrayed as if Bruce Wayne is thinking this way. Like he thinks that the Riddler knows his identity, and he's scared that it's going to be. He even says to Gordon the one time they're about to play a video, and it's like the title is like the real unmasking or something like that, and Batman's like, I think that this is coming to an end or something like that. Like basically, like he's worried that it's about to be revealed. So we very much like that clue is there, and I didn't even think of that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, we very much think that.
I think you're meant to not know it towards the end, because they really frame it, as you said, like Batman knows, like, okay, it's the jig's up, and you see like the camera cuts to like there's a camera in the prison that's recording it, so he's like, oh shit, this is gonna go on record. But then he's like, oh, we almost got Bruce Wayne too, and then suddenly like this whole tension just like something just breaks.
Yeah,
I'm not sure, like that. It's interesting because I've heard reactions from other people who were unsure, like at the end of the film, like, did the Riddler know if Bruce Wayne was the Batman or not? But on second viewing, it's quite obvious. But I feel like it might be a bit overshadowed by the stuff that comes afterwards.
Right.
But yeah, the one thing I wanted to talk about with regards to the Riddler is the issue of conspiracy theories and how that sort of plays into our current perception of conspiracy theories and what their implications in the real world, which I think have significantly changed over the last few years in our age of internet and misinformation and online radicalization. Because I think from a storytelling perspective, like conspiracy theories have been around like forever, and they've always been these rather fun things. They're basically just like puzzles, or like this the sense that there's something that's covered up and it's enticing and
Yeah.
you want to know what's behind it. But right now, I think we're moving into this reality where we can really see the implications that conspiracy theories have on individuals and also communities and groups of people. We've seen,
Yeah.
so besides even like the actual acts of violence that have been born from conspiracy theories and individuals who sort of fall into that, you also see it in just the more general sense that people are losing connection with each other, and everyone's kind of living in their own parallel reality, and some of which are more harmful than others. But I think my main issue is, to what extent is it a problem that we have this Riddler character who is clearly associated with an online space, like he has this online community
Yes.
that's radicalized him and some others. And to what extent is it a problem that he believes in this conspiracy theory, which turns out to be right, like
Right.
at
Yeah.
least for the most part.
Yeah. That whole maneuver of like expanding the Riddler kind of into a commentary about conspiracy theories and radicalization and like these things, I didn't love entirely, because I think while it's relevant and like those are definitely issues that are worth exploring and addressing in a film, by the time it comes into play in like the third act, I don't think there's time to really kind of explore that thoroughly. And so it ends up being like a little bit almost exploitative of like, oh, here's a thing you might be afraid that's happening in society or in the world right now. And so like, we're going to utilize that to make a very scary bad guy. There was even a really uncomfortable moment, and content warning, I'm about to talk about some graphic violence, real world events, but like there was a very uncomfortable moment for me where as that ending is happening, where there's all the guys going up into the stadium with the guns, I remembered, I don't know if you remember, but there was a shooting in the United States at a Batman premiere in Colorado. And like I remembered that suddenly as like that scene was happening. And so I'm like sitting in the theater watching, and like suddenly there was about 5 minutes where I was like, just became very paranoid.
Wow.
And like it almost felt to me like the film was kind of exploiting that like feeling, because obviously Matt Reeves is, I think, going to be aware of that. Like there's been multiple Batman premieres like since that happened in the US, but it's still there. And so I feel like it was used, but it wasn't really fully addressed. I mean, there's a scene where Batman's like, they kind of emphasize Batman's anti-gun. So the movie has like an anti-gun message. It's not glorifying that stuff in any means. And I don't think it glorifies that violence in a real way. Like I like that it stays away from those guys' perspectives for the most part. It doesn't like engage us with like, ooh, it's exciting to be one of these like radicalized shooters or something. But it did make me a little bit uncomfortable. And I wish like if they were going to go there, that maybe they did that in a more thorough way. And then like you said, when you add to that the fact that like it turns out the Riddler, is kind of right. And it's like that makes things messy in a way that is a little harder to reconcile.
Yeah. I wonder how it would have been if it turned out that the Riddler wasn't just wrong about Bruce Wayne's Batman or like his identity, but would have been wrong like completely, because he does like the thing is he exposes the corruption, and then he's correct in, or at least like not morally correct, but he's correct in the sense that like he suspects this conspiracy which was actually there, but then he does take it too far. Like he's like, okay, we're gonna just kill all of them, even though it clearly now goes into areas of irrationality. But that initial suspicion is still sort of redeemed from his perspective. Like he was, he was shown as being right. So it does feel like him being wrong about the Batman, or him going like a bit too far at the end, feels like a bit of a footnote to what should have been, I think, the main revelation about the Riddler, if they are going that route of him being like a conspiracy theorist that just spends his time in those such fringe communities. So I wonder if it would have been, or how it would have worked if it was revealed that the Riddler was just completely wrong, like that he may have accidentally exposed like a different conspiracy that
Right.
ultimately the Batman solves, but then
Yeah.
it turns out that his reasoning or his entire view on this whole thing was just completely mistaken or misguided or ridiculous. Like maybe he suspected all of them to be like lizard people in the end. Or I think it would have been a good move on the film's part to really subvert that in that moment. Like just
Yeah.
doesn't show him as being like, oh, he doesn't know who the Batman is, but just show him as being completely like detached from any sense of reality. I think when it comes to, if you want to make a comment on those issues, I think it would have been a much better direction. Though I did think it was interesting that the Riddler and his followers were directly inspired by the Batman and his actions. He literally looks up to the Batman, and you see like some parallels, like the opening scene, you have this voyeuristic perspective, which we also get with the Batman when he looks at Catwoman for the first time. Like he's also on a roof on the opposite end of the street, and he's looking at her through like binoculars.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the "I am vengeance" line, which I'm pretty sure, like, it was suggested that they deliberately co-opted that line from the Batman instead of just accidentally saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Though I'm not entirely sure about this. The one thing I am still conflicted about when it comes to the Riddler's plan is whether or not he knew, because he wants to expose the rat and bring him to light. And then at the end, it is revealed that when Batman brings out the rat, which is revealed to be Falcone, then the Riddler was shown to be in some hotel or some room on the opposite end, and he was already like the whole time looking at the entrance of that club waiting for a chance to strike at the mob boss. Yeah. But I wasn't sure, like, did the Riddler know who the rat was, or did he need Batman to figure that out too? Because Falcone left the club earlier to go to the memorial because he was outside, like he was not a complete recluse. Or like a completely reclusive person.
Right.
So yeah, I wonder, it's a bit nitpicky, but I wonder like if there wasn't a chance for the Riddler, if he just wanted to kill Falcone or just had to have him come out of that club, wouldn't there have been a chance earlier?
Yeah, there's a few holes there. And I definitely agree. I think like the best move would have been either to, like you said, have the Riddler be like wrong, at least in some significant ways, or maybe completely, or just to like, or if you had just left him as kind of like a lone actor, and you don't have to have this element of like there's people online being radicalized and then going and shooting up a stadium full of people. Like, you could have just left it at like, oh, here's a tension between this guy who discovered, and maybe he even blows up the water and floods the city, but he's not like a conspiracy theorist who's got a team of people on the internet, ready to fight for him. So I would have loved if it had been a little more delicate, or if it was going to go into that territory, exploring it a little bit better.
Yeah, because it wouldn't have been an issue if it had avoided it altogether. Yeah. I think if it was just a revenge move from the Riddler's point of view. Like I thought at first, like on my first viewing, I thought the reveal was going to be that the Riddler was the son of the journalist who got killed. But I saw some hints on the internet that that's going to be another character, Hush. I'm not familiar with who that is, but that might be a hint there towards a different character that's going to be introduced later on. But yeah, I wish they had, as you said, done it either more delicately or more consciously, or just did away with it altogether.
Yeah.
One thing I'll add for as far as Batman's revelation towards the end, that with regards to also with the conspiracy, is that I thought it was also interesting that the conspiracy is linked to the renewal charity fund, which was set up by his parents, but then which got neglected later on, which made it vulnerable for all these corrupted individuals to, I'm not sure exactly how it would work, but they would move money through it or launder money or just do like corrupted things.
Yeah.
Which is actually like, when you think about it, that's more like not so much a direct consequence, but it is linked to also Bruce Wayne not being Bruce Wayne, but choosing to be Batman.
Yeah.
Because you see him, like, if he was responsible and he had taken on like his parents' legacy with more awareness or more oversight, like maybe he would have been able to spot all this or prevent all this, like as a citizen, or as like in his case as a wealthy and powerful citizen instead of devoting all his time to just being the Batman and trying to solve crime from like the bottom up instead of from the top down as he maybe could have done. And so
Yeah.
that's one thing I also felt was missing a bit. Like there was no real character arc it felt for Bruce Wayne. Like we got one for the Batman, but as for Bruce Wayne, there's no real resolution towards the end. Like, oh, maybe I'm gonna be more responsible as a citizen now as well, instead of just maybe even just like they set up as you said, the mayor who wanted to talk with Bruce Wayne, and then it's not really followed up on towards the end, even though it was such an easy moment to maybe insert that somewhere. But yeah, maybe it might be that they are saving that for the sequel, that in the sequel we might get more of Bruce Wayne.
Yeah.
Even though I didn't necessarily think, I thought it was be a one-off film, but I think it's pretty clear that there's going to be more. Also with like the Joker is, of course, briefly mentioned or briefly shown.
Of course.
Of course.
Because you can't have a Batman film apparently without some Joker reference in it somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I took it kind of like as implied to some extent that arc would happen with Bruce Wayne since he made that shift as Batman.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think they could have. There was a bunch of stuff, almost everything for me personally. This is just on a more personal note, like almost everything that happens like after that. There was a second where like during that shot, that awesome shot of Batman with the flare, I thought for a second like that's where the movie was going to end, and I kind of wish it had, because like almost everything that comes after that I feel like weakens it. Like there's just kind of this scene where he basically like reiterates everything that we just saw symbolically like in voiceover, and then there's like some extra setup, and we see the Joker, and I know why you kind of have to have all that stuff in there to fulfill the role of being like a blockbuster superhero film. But you could have easily done a little bit more productive stuff in that space where instead of reiterating the lesson we had just learned, maybe we continue to see how like that change or that shift for Batman like is impacting his actions, or but again, if they're planning for a sequel, maybe they're leaving some room.
Yeah, I was also a bit let down by the actual ending. I think that for me that's one of the moments where for me I was really reminded of the genius of Nolan and his Dark Knight, and in his other films too. Like all of his films tend to end on this climactic accumulation of like the thematic resolution, and then we see all the loose ends being tied up, and sometimes even in like a single shot or like just a sentence, and it all comes together, like it builds tension and then it just cuts to black. And then I felt this one was more like it meandered more a little bit and then sizzled out, even though we get the same cut to black with the Batman on the Batmobile or the Bat bike. I felt like that could have been re-edited into like from the moment that you see, I think right after the flare scene where you see then it's the day after and it's shown that Batman is on the roof helping people, and you do get this nice moment that now you see like the citizen clinging on instead of being afraid of him. Like he's shown himself to be like a hero and just a savior in general. And yeah, I think it could have been better wrapped up with like this cool montage. You have like the voiceover again, and then it all comes together. Maybe we see like Selena Kyle who's going her own way, and then cut it down to like a sentence or two. And then as you said, it could have been a bit more productive with the time that it had. Like it could have been a bit more efficient, but like more on a punch instead of just slowly fading out. But yeah, overall I thought it was a pretty satisfying conclusion, at least thematically.
A question for you real quick. This movie walks kind of up to the line of like critiquing a little bit like maybe a white savior narrative, or like a man as like a heroic savior. It plays with critiquing that idea, that concept, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly. Do you think it kind of trips into like then reinforcing that in the narrative in the end? Or do you think it's doing it in a way that's nuanced enough to kind of like take into consideration the critiques that maybe it's leveling against that narrative?
Yeah, like at the time of recording, like my last video was specifically about that. I think the important thing about superheroes and promoting like actual responsibility is that I think it was a pretty complex video. I'm not sure how to summarize it best in like a sentence or two, but I think what it comes down to is that even if you feel like you have this great heroic purpose, that doesn't alleviate you from the responsibilities that you also have as a citizen, going with
Right.
the superhero analogy, and that you still, it's fine. You can be like Batman, but you also have to be Bruce Wayne, and you have to
Right.
take care of all that too. And I like that it de-romanticizes that fantasy a little bit by having Bruce Wayne actually show the cost of being Batman. Like you see, Bruce
Yeah.
Wayne is not like this revered or like admired person, but more of a reclusive person. And I like how it points out some of the privileges, because a lot of these heroes, they can do what they do because they have other people who do the stuff that they don't want to do. Like
Yeah.
Iron Man
Yeah.
has like Pepper and Happy and all the other supporting
Yeah.
characters. James Bond has a whole team behind him. Batman obviously has Alfred and other characters who help him out throughout his journey. So yeah, there needs to be like, I think it's important that there's some recognition that it's not, you can be like a source for good on your own. Like you have ties
Yeah.
to other people who help you and who are just as important. But yeah, I think in the end it does come back to the Fight Club paradox a little bit. Like, to what extent can you promote or like present this idea, but not so effectively that it overshadows the ultimate critique of it? But
Yeah.
looking at this film from the context of that video that I made, I think this is a good step in the right direction. I do wonder a bit to what extent the Batman as a myth or like as a cultural phenomenon fits this story. Well, because in the end, I think Batman does demand, to some extent at least, a city that's corrupted enough for a Batman to arise. Like, I
Yeah.
wonder to what extent, if the Batman becomes like the savior during the day and the person who just helps others, like to what extent does he just become like any other superhero? And at what point do you undermine like the essence of the Batman?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it's worth asking to what extent we want to cling on to the Batman as a myth.
Yeah.
I'm personally like fine with it. Like I think this movie shows that we can get like fresh takes or like
Yeah. Yeah.
entertaining takes on this character. But yeah, it's a difficult question, and it probably depends on like, it's in the eyes of the beholder. I think to each their
Right.
own. Yeah.
I think this Batman works well as the movie that it is. I don't really see how you can have sequels to this that are as thematically interesting, although that doesn't mean it's impossible. I'm not Matt Reeves, and maybe he has ideas, and assuming it's him that does it. And just because there's not legitimate room to expand from here doesn't mean they won't try to do it anyway. We'll see.
Yeah.
But I do think there's a definitely a contrast here between, like, if you think about the ending of, say, Batman Begins, even, it's like Batman is the one guy who takes down what's his name, Ra's al Ghul or whatever, and like saves the whole city from like the brink of this collapse. Whereas like in this, he does do that one kind of self-sacrificial gesture of like, he saves the people in that little area from electrocution, but like that's just a small group of people. The whole city is still flooded, and at the end he's kind of reduced to like being one of the paramedics, essentially. Like there's nothing that's like ultimately special about Batman that's making him more capable of like single-handedly saving the city than like any of the other people that are around him. So I think it's more nuanced in how it's like kind of presenting that resolution, which I think is interesting. So and yeah, I think the myth of Batman in our culture is relevant as long as there's corruption. So I think, and that's one of the tensions of the movie, is that like, it teeters up maybe against validating some conspiracies that are dangerous to validate. But then there's also like police corruption and some of the other things and the mishandling of funds that are meant for helping people are also very real things that happen in our world. So there's a legitimate critique of corruption there too. And that's part of why it gets a little messy, potentially. But yeah, I think with the character arc that Batman is making in this film, it's hard to imagine a way in which you can like extend that arc forward and still have like a Batman that makes a lot of sense. But we'll see.
I feel like Batman exists on this weird spectrum in between, on the one hand, Rorschach and like the complete, like the darkest iteration of just having this unhinged murderer who's punishing what he sees as the bad people, and something like Captain America on the other hand, who's just more purely good and virtuous and sees the best in people and tries to help them. And Batman sort of exists, to me at least, in a little bit in the middle, which is, when we've seen him shift like back and forth like a little bit between different kinds of Batman. But I don't have like a definitive answer on where he should, like what the best place for the Batman is to exist in this whole world. But about vigilantism, I do think it is something that, as you said, it arises out of a genuine feeling of powerlessness. It's not something that, I don't think, like, we just have those happy or like violent fantasies about punishing people or doing harm. I think there's definitely a sense that people can really feel powerlessness or like disempowered by greater forces, like by corruption on a larger level or by some other failure of like, because it doesn't have to always be like malicious corruption. Like it can also be just like a failure of like a justice system, even if everyone acts within it with the best of intentions. So I think the allure of like taking justice into your own hands will always be there. But I think the best thing that stories can do in this sense is what this Batman, I think, largely succeeds in doing, is showing like where this can lead you and what might be like a better course of action.
Yeah. I think that's very well said. I don't really have anything to add to that. I think we both enjoyed this movie, and I think it goes to some very like fascinating and interesting places. And even if it's doing that in like maybe a flawed way, or it's not perfect in doing that, I think what I loved was that it was obviously a film that got down into that nitty gritty a little bit and actually did have some interesting things to kind of explore and say, and didn't just kind of gesture at interesting things. There's been, I think, a lot of superhero movies recently that have tried to go in that direction of like exploring some deeper ideas, but they don't end up cohering into anything fascinating. And this movie does it maybe somewhat imperfectly, but it actually kind of dives into that area, which I liked. And it just has the coolest that scene that is lit entirely by muzzle flash as Batman like is fighting the I wrote this in a review on Letterboxd, but like I hate automatic weapons in movies. Like I think it's the most boring. Like there's so many movies where the climax is just a bunch of people like firing at each other with automatic weapons. There was two, like Wrath of Man and Nobody from last year, both like use that as like a climactic device. And I'm just like, it's just so much chaos and noise that it's like not even interesting to watch. And so I kind of hate automatic weapons in movies for that reason. But I was like, this scene is the single best use of automatic weapons in any movie, which is just, why not light a whole scene with them? And I thought that scene and just the chase scene in the
highway scene with the Batmobile,
were so like stylistically like gripping and moody and like I just loved it so much. So if nothing else, deep, profound existential meaning, whatever, political, socio-political commentary aside, maybe that's the wrong message to take away, but I was entranced to a certain degree. So now I need to examine my complicity and feeling like being a badass who takes vengeance on criminals is cool.
Yep, same. Time for some reflecting.
Yes.
Well, thank you all for listening. If you enjoy the show, be sure to check us out on our creator-owned streaming service Nebula, where you can listen to all of our episodes a week early. Right now, the best way to get access to Nebula is by signing up for CuriosityStream, which comes with a free Nebula subscription. To learn more, just follow the link in the show notes, and we'll see you again next time.